Jacob Miller woke up one day to a terrible headache. It was a headache that unfortunately would follow him for decades. You see, in this battle during the Civil War, his men were taking a beating. Their bodies were littering the battlefield. The retreating soldiers left him and a bunch of other men for dead. He looked like he was dead because he had taken a bullet straight to the head, right between the eyes. So he'd been left for dead. But despite all of this, he was still somehow alive. Now, faced with a wound that should have killed him, some men might have given up hope. With the enemy advancing upon him, laying there, waking up on a battlefield with a bullet hole right between his eyes, some people might have given up hope. But not Jacob. Jacob said to himself as he used his rifle to steady himself and pick himself up off the ground like a walking stick, he said, "I will not be taken prisoner." So stealthily, he made his way back across that battlefield. Finding at last some medical personnel who put him on a stretcher and carried him to a hospital with other severely wounded soldiers. Now, in that wartime hospital with severely wounded soldiers, it was necessary to triage. So the lightly wounded come last. Those who needed immediate attention got it. And those who it was deemed were mortally wounded beyond all hope were left to die. They were given something to ease their discomfort, to make their transition as comfortable as possible, but they were left to die. But Jacob had hope. The doctors came around, they made a list of people who they could move with them to the next place on the battlefield, and those that would be left behind. And as they came to him, they saw the bullet still lodged squarely in his forehead. They decided that he could not be moved. And so the reasoning was, if you were left behind, you might be taken prisoner by the enemy, but then maybe, just maybe, you could be reacquired by an exchange of prisoners. So maybe they could get you back. But anyway, you were about to die anyway. And there was no hope for you, really. But Jacob had hope. And he said, once again, I will not be a prisoner. So he asked the nurse, "Will you fill my canteen full of water?" And later, he snuck out of the tent. He found some vehicles over by the side of the road. He hid behind them. As they left, he snuck behind the vehicles. He made his way down that dirt road, dragging one foot behind him, trying to go somewhere where he could have more hope. So he's dragging his foot down the road, trying to go down the battlefield, not being able to see that well, because when you've taken a bullet right above the eyes, it tends to impact your vision. So he's kind of trudging down the road, and there's a low-hanging branch. He walks right into it, knocks himself out. He's laying on the ground. So another medical team comes through, and they find him. They wake him up. They take him to another hospital. He goes from one hospital to the next. And it's not for another 9 months that he finally has a surgery. And I think we have a picture of some of the, what that is. It's some of the stuff that was lodged in his forehead. So he received the surgery 9 months after the fact that would remove the musket ball. That's the largest ball that you see there. And then the 3 other parts, the way this typically happened was there would be buckshot in there too. So 9 months after the fact, he never gave up hope. He finally had that musket ball removed. 17 years later, a piece of buckshot fell out of the wound on its own. And 31 years later, 2 pieces of lead fell out. All the while, Jacob Miller was still walking around with a gaping wound in his head from that fateful day when he was left for dead. When his comrades, when people who had been in his company saw him, they said, we thought you were dead. We were sure you were dead after that wound, but he still somehow survived. We have a picture of him. Now, here he is wearing his Medal of Honor. And it's worth mentioning that the Medal of Honor that he's wearing is not from the story I just told you. That was actually from another fateful mission that happened before that. It was a suicide mission. It was a mission so dangerous that only single men were allowed to volunteer for it. And only 79 men out of the 150 came back alive. But on that mission, leading the charge, was Jacob and a few other men who were collectively known as the Forlorn Hope. You see, even before Jacob was shot in the head and left for dead and found enough hope and courage to go across that battlefield and not give up hope, not be left for dead, but continue on until he got what he needed, even before then, he had demonstrated that he was a man who held on to hope against all odds. Now, many years before this, in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 7, we read about another battle that seemed without hope. God's people resided in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Israel is about to go to war against its brothers and sisters in the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, why would that happen? Why would God's people in Israel go against God's people in Judah? Well, what happened was the southern kingdom of Judah had a new king, King Ahaz. He was about 20 and foolish. I'm sure nobody can relate to being foolish in your 20s. He was young and foolish, and here's what happens. He comes to power, he gets on the throne, and Israel has formed a coalition with Syria against the Assyrians. The Assyrians are coming in, they're conquering people, and Israel and Syria have formed this coalition to protect themselves, to protect God's people against foreign invaders. They come to King Ahaz, they say, hey, why don't you join us? Welcome to being a king. Why don't you join us, and we will help fight off these Assyrians. But King Ahaz has other plans. He decides he's going to side with the Assyrians. He figures, if I side with the Assyrians, maybe they will show mercy to me, mercy to my kingdom. He was going to betray God's people. He's going to put his hope not in God and not in God's people, but in the enemy. He has more hope in the enemy than he does God and God's people. Now, the Assyrians haven't invaded yet. He still has time. He has time to change his mind. He has time now. It hasn't happened yet. He can do the right thing. And that's where we find the prophet Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah is having this conversation with King Ahaz in chapter 7 of the book of Isaiah, starting in verse 2. Now, the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out, you and your son Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and of the son of Remaliah. So Isaiah, when he comes up to the king, he really wants to support the king. He believes in the kingship. He wants to support the king, but he also realizes this is not the king that Judah needs at this time. So he comes to have this conversation with Ahaz. And the interesting thing about Isaiah is that not only does he prophesy, but all of his children serve as testaments. So one of his children is named A Remnant Shall Return, which tells you a little bit about what Isaiah is going to prophesy. He brings his son, A Remnant Shall Return, to go talk to this king. The king has two options. He can follow God, he can put his hope in God, and things might go okay. The impending doom might not happen. Or he can put his hope in Assyria, and bad things are going to happen, but God's going to remain true to his promise that he was going to keep a ruler on the throne of King David. And so God will not let all of God's people be destroyed. A remnant shall return. People will be kicked out of the land, but a small group shall return. So let's see what Isaiah tells Ahaz in the second half of verse 9 in this chapter. He tells him, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Isaiah goes on later in this book, in chapter 32, the first 8 verses, to describe what it would look like for a righteous king to stand. He is confronted with an evil king. Then we have the perfect example of what an evil king might do, a wicked king, a foolish king. And I encourage you later to read those first 8 verses of chapter 32, because we see Isaiah list out what a righteous king would do. How might a good king do this? What is the example? Isaiah is laying it all out there. But a king who puts his hope in the enemies of God, a king who puts his hope in things other than God that are opposed to God, that king cannot stand. his kingdom will fall. But don't worry, because someone will come along who will take his seat, who will take that throne, someone who's worthy of it. And in that, God's people have hope. There's this eager anticipation. As we look through the prophecies of Isaiah and so many other prophecies in the Old Testament, there's this eager anticipation that God is going to bring a deliverer, a Messiah, a Redeemer. So get ready, because hope is on the way. Now, growing up, I was spoiled as a kid. This is where my wife might laugh and say, "You're spoiled now." But I was an only child. And I always remember around this time of year, I was so excited. I had this eager anticipation for toys. And I tended to get what I asked for. I might not get every single thing I asked for, but I got most of it. I got the most important things. I got what I asked for. And so I always remember where my bed was. I could look past the foot of the bed, and there was these shelves that my father built for me. That was where the prized possessions went. That was where the best toys went. I had a closet with other toys in it and everything, but there was only a little bit of space on these shelves. So that's where the prized possessions went. So I would put, if there was something I was expecting, I knew that's where it was going to go. So in eager anticipation of what I knew was coming soon, I would clear a space on the shelves. And see, I had studied what I wanted. Back in those days, we didn't have the internet, but we had the Sears catalog. So I knew the dimensions of the toys that I wanted, and I set out space on the shelves accordingly. This toy's going to go here, this toy's going to go here. I got out my little school ruler and measured it like I was preparing King Solomon's temple. I knew where the prized possessions were going to go. So I circled in that Sears catalog in red marker. I wrote down item numbers because I was helpful. Behold, mother and father, it says in the second book of Sears that, lo, a man shall come that will save his people, and his name shall be He-Man. And we read on page 47, starting with item 1173, that the accessories are a plastic sword and castle grayskull, and its dimensions shall be 15 by 26 inches. So saith the good book. So I studied over the Sears catalog like most people would study the Bible. So I was in. I was all in. I was ready in eager anticipation. I had prepared a place for that which I hoped for. And this morning, we're in the first Sunday of Advent. Advent being a word that means coming or the arrival. We're anticipating the arrival of Jesus, the celebration of his birth. In the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, we celebrate themes of hope, love, joy, and peace. And this Sunday, we celebrate hope. And much like I prepared a place on the shelf in anticipation for some silly toy that I wanted, I want to invite us all to prepare a space in our hearts this morning in anticipation of the coming of Jesus. If he's not already in your heart, maybe he is in your heart, but you've allowed other stuff to crowd up over top of him. You put him on the shelf, you put other things on top of the shelf. Maybe he's in your heart, you say, I know I left Jesus over here somewhere. He's underneath my more prized possessions. I took him off the prized shelf, the most important things. I put him in the closet with the other toys and other things on top of him. Or maybe you never knew God. Maybe this morning you don't have that relationship with Jesus. You've never had that with him. He has never had a place in your heart. You've never prepared a place for him. I would encourage you to do so this morning. Every year, as we talk about the anticipation, during Advent, as we talk about the anticipation of the people towards the coming of Jesus Christ, I always think about these prophecies that we see in the Old Testament, and these prophecies that's coming, this eager anticipation for hundreds and hundreds of years, that they anticipated what we now know as hope realized. But for them was still hope that had not yet arrived, but they knew about it. They knew that Jesus was coming. Isaiah did not live long enough to see Jesus, but yet he had hope. Moses writes in Numbers 24:17, and I feel like Isaiah would say similar to this too. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not yet. So even though he was seeing his king, Isaiah saw his king Ahaz betraying God and betraying God's people, before his very eyes. And even though he knew the kind of consequences that was going to happen, he knew Ahaz was wicked. He knew Ahaz was going to make the wrong choice. He knew what was going to happen. Even though despite all of that, Isaiah sees all of this with his son, a remnant shall return, at his side. Even though he sees all this, Isaiah could write about hope. He still had hope. We all could use a little bit of the hope that's found in Jesus. So let's take a look and turn back to the book of Isaiah. So, we left off with Ahaz putting his hope in Assyria, and God tells Ahaz, he says, ask me for a sign. So before we even talk about that sign, what that sign is, I want to examine this a little bit. We have to kind of pump the brakes here and look at God tells this wicked king, ask me for a sign. Now, God doesn't always do signs. And a lot of times when God does a sign, he does it for people who already believe. But here he is with this unbelieving king, and he's not doing the sign yet. He's saying, ask me for a sign. It's as if God has laid out, he says, I have a blessing in one hand, I have a curse in one hand. Now, Ahaz, this is where you ask me what the blessing is. He's spelling it out for Ahaz. He is showing remarkable grace, mercy, and patience for King Ahaz. But Ahaz simply refuses to ask. Ask me for a sign. Ask me for what the blessing is going to be. Ahaz, I'm just waiting. Ask me for what it's going to be. But Ahaz says, no, I'm not going to ask you. He tries to play it off that he doesn't want to bother God. He doesn't want to inconvenience God. When God is saying, no, I'm telling you, ask me. But no, I don't want to inconvenience him. And probably, because Ahaz is turning against God, Ahaz is turning against his people. If you say, ask God what the blessing is going to be, he says, well, what if the blessing for God's people is that their enemies will be destroyed? I'm their enemy. I don't want to ask what the blessing is right now. I don't want to know what's coming. Perhaps that's what's in Ahaz's heart that day as he refuses to ask God what is around the corner. Maybe he just doesn't want to know. But what's coming, the prophecy that is what's coming, is greater than King Ahaz. It's greater than any other king that has been, or any that would come after. The king who would take his rightful place on the throne. We see the prophecy laid out in Isaiah 7:14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. And now let's jump over to chapter 9, starting with verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you, as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle, and every garment rolled in blood, will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on King David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So the rightful ruler will come, conquer the enemy. There will be no more need for war. He will be the Prince of Peace, and not just for a little while, but for all of eternity. So the land is in darkness and it's in despair, but the people who have been waiting in darkness have seen a great light. So this morning, we too, like those people hearing these prophecies, we too have hope. Do you ever feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders? Do you ever feel like that? The weight of the world is on your shoulders. Well, into this story walks Jesus, who will one day bear the weight of the world, all of our transgressions on his shoulders, carrying the world's sins all the way up to the cross, all the way up to Mount Calvary. Do you ever feel like you're walking in darkness, like you can't see what's going on, like it's something scary is around the corner and you just can't tell, like the world is bleak? Well, Jesus comes in as the light. He lives in our hearts, and he calls us to be the light of the world. Have you seen enough war on television? Particularly the homegrown terrorism that threatens to encroach closer and closer to us. Isn't it great to know that Jesus will one day put an end to such war, violence, and bloodshed, that we'll beat our weapons into plowshares, that we will burn our blood-soaked garments? And isn't it great to know that even when things sometimes look down now, that God is with us? In Micah 5:2, it says of him that he will be born in Bethlehem, and that his foundations are from old, from ancient times. We know him as the Ancient of Days, who was there before the foundations of the world. In Genesis 3:15, right after our very first sin, we hear the first prophecy about the Messiah, that he will come and he will crush the serpent, he will crush the devil, he will have the victory there. So even immediately after our very first sin, we have the very first prophecy that God is going to send his son, Jesus Christ, who is going to conquer sin. Right from the beginning, the moment that we mess up, God has a plan to bring us back to him, to reconcile all man to him. He is the God who draws near in so many ways. There's a lot more that we could say about Jesus that's found in the book of Isaiah, and we won't go over all of those this morning. But if we look at Isaiah 52:13, we see my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. And in 53:2 we read, there was nothing spectacular about his appearance. That's one of the verses I love about Jesus coming into this world. He didn't come in looking like a supermodel, trying to win a clothing contract or a record deal or anything like that. He came in looking ordinary. There was nothing that would draw us to him based on his appearance. It was who he really was. It wasn't based on looks. His mission was not to look pretty. His mission was to go to that cross, that ugly cross, and to die for all of our sins, and to be resurrected, to raise again, and to show us new life, to take his rightful place at the right hand of God the Father. Going back to Numbers 24:17, Moses writes about God who raises a scepter that will be seen near and far. Now, when I was a youth minister, I had this redneck of an idea. If y'all know me, that's not that unlikely. I have redneck ideas sometimes. Well, back when I was a youth minister, we would go to camps, we would go to concerts, and sometimes the group would be divided up. So you had all these kids that you had to gather back to you. And so I came up with an idea. I never ended up doing this, but I thought what I would do is take an extension pole, like a painter's pole, that starts off a bit this high and then extend it out so it can stand far up above all of the masses. And I was going to take one of those red lights that spin around, it looks like a police light, and affix it to that pole so that when I went somewhere and I needed to get all the kids back with me, I could extend that pole and you could see from near and far. I never ended up doing that because I didn't want to carry all of that around with me, and it looks kind of stupid. But I thought if I shone a beacon out across a field, these kids could come from very far. They probably wouldn't play me, actually, but they would probably come and they could come back to that light. But God raises a scepter in Numbers 24, and it shines a light clear across the pages of the Old Testament, all the way into the New Testament, and it shines that light on Jesus. You can't miss it. The prophecies are clear. Are you looking for the Messiah? Well, he's the one that's been prophesied about. He can be found raising his scepter, shining a light in the darkness and bringing peace. And that's where we have our hope. I don't know what you might have going on in your life this morning, but I can certainly say that we all need hope. There was some research done that said people who are in despair, there is a condition where your arteries narrow. Sometimes people get this when they smoke about a pack a day. They found that people who are in despair have the same risk of that condition as people who smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. So despair is as dangerous for you as smoking is. We all need hope. And we all put our hope in something. We all put our hope maybe in someone. And people are things. But my challenge to you this morning is don't be like Ahaz. Don't put your hope in things that are in opposition to God. Don't put your hope in things or people who stand in opposition to God. Put your hope in God. Now, sometimes that means waiting on God. Waiting for an answer and you're still waiting. Sometimes that answer is no, sometimes it's yes, but sometimes It's just wait. Sometimes we have to follow God, even when it seems like it's not making sense. I don't know how many of you have ever read the book Guidepost. I think it releases once a month, that little magazine. It's kind of like a Reader's Digest. In the book Guidepost, Ronald Pinkerton, who was a pilot, had as a hobby hang gliding. And one day he was in his hang glider. He was about 4,200 feet up in the air. And suddenly this wind hit him and started pushing him down in his hang glider. He loses control. And he's trying to recover. He's 4,200 feet up in the air. He gets pushed down. He's trying desperately to recover. And as he's trying to figure out what he's going to do, he looks to his right, and about 6 feet off of the right wingtip, there's this red-tailed hawk. And it's in the same wind that he's in. It's in the same fix that he's in, trying to recover from this sudden gust of wind. But he's trying to recover, and he sees the hawk banked into the downwind. Now, as a pilot, he says, that's making sense. That's suicide. You don't go into the downwind, you want to go in the upwind to generate lift to kind of pick you back up. But something within him says, follow the hawk. So he follows the hawk, he turns, he banks with the hawk, and suddenly he feels this thermal wind come up underneath him and lift him up. He can't explain it, and all of his years of being a pilot, that goes against everything that he thought made sense. But this thermal wind comes and lifts him up about 100 feet off away from certain destruction. If that wind had not hit, it had been over. Sometimes following God, hoping in God, is a little like following that hawk. What do you mean go this way? That's suicide. What do you mean do this? That doesn't make any sense. That's the exact opposite of where I should go or what I should do. And yet, when we follow God, He lifts us up on wings like eagles. And one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So where do you put your trust? Is it in your own plans? Or is it in God's hands? Or are you going to be like Ahaz and say, I know everything's going to be okay because Assyria is with us? Or are you going to follow God and say, I know everything's going to be okay because God is with us, Emmanuel? If you have never put your trust in Jesus Christ, I encourage you to do so this morning. If you've not yet joined this church, I hope you'll join us today. We're a band of believers who are united in the hope that is found in Jesus. If there's something other than Jesus that you're putting your hope in this morning, I hope you'll surrender it to Him today. Placing all things behind Him and putting Jesus Christ as your focus, as your priority. Won't you please come forward as we sing this final hymn.